Everyone. Sorry. All right. So today we are picking up with Spinoza and looking at propositions 11 through 22. But I want to begin by doing a quick recap of what we discussed in class on Monday. So Spinoza is a Dutch philosopher, as we discussed, and his dates are 1632 to 77. He's coming right out of the Cartesian tradition and is responding to Descartes he's elaborating and deepening Descartes' philosophy. And so he's setting out to construct this geometric proof of his argument. And so he lays out his definitions and his axioms, and then through a series of propositions intends to prove his philosophical point. Right? So let's review these definitions. Right? By that which is, so this is the opening, right? What we have as our foundation. The first is a definition of the self-caused, right? By that which is self-caused, I mean that whose essence involves existence, or that whose nature can be conceived only as existing. Right? So all self-caused things are those whose essence involves existence. Number two, a thing is said to be finite in its own kind when it can be limited by another thing of the same nature. Right? So finitude means limited, and limited by a being like yourself. Right? Substance would be limited by another substance, a thought by another thought. So definition three, by substance, I mean that which is in itself and is conceived through itself. So that the key point here is the in itself and conceived through itself. Substance, what will count as substance, that being, right, which underlies change, that which remains the same through change, can only be understood in itself and conceived through itself. Number four, by attribute, I mean that which the intellect perceives of substance as constituting its essence. Okay, right. So I just want to reiterate this point that what this means is that attribute is not the same as a quality or a characteristic. Attribute is that which constitutes a thing's essence. Right? So attribute is a kind of essence, in distinction from an attribute like the color of a thing or its size, which in most of the philosophical tradition would not be related to its essence. Right? Fifth definition, by mode, I mean the affections of substance. That is that which is in something else and is conceived through something else. And six, by God, I mean an absolutely infinite being. That is substance consisting of infinite attributes, right? So substance consisting of infinite attributes. And this question of infinity and infinite attributes will be important. Then the final two definitions, right? Freedom, that thing is said to be free, which exists solely from the necessity of its own nature and is determined to action by itself alone. Freedom means following one's own nature, one's own essence. And the final definition, eternity. By eternity, I mean existence itself, insofar as it is conceived as necessarily following from the definition of an eternal thing. Okay. Now, it's important to just keep these definitions in mind as we're walking through this text, because really the argument lies in these definitions. And so many of the propositions follow naturally from those definitions. So to summarize, in the first 10 propositions, what is established is the unity of being. Right? So this idea of substance, right? Substance which is in itself and conceived through itself. Spinoza's big idea is the nature of substance and what substance must be. So the first chunk of propositions, the first 10 or so, is dedicated to proving that there can only be one substance. And the crucial point in that, I think, is that substance can only be conceived through itself. In order for a thing to be a substance, it should be able to be conceived solely through itself. Now, if there were more than one substance, that would mean that those two substances would have to have absolutely nothing in common. Right? That they could be conceived only through themselves. And there is nothing in our experience, there's nothing in the world that has no relation to anything else in the world. Right? Everything is related to everything else in being in our world. And so there is no individual thing that we can point to and say, I can understand that solely through itself. And the sort of most powerful point in this argument, that everything is conceived through something else in being, is about causality, causation. If substance is the key term in Spinoza, the meaning of substance is derived through an understanding of causation. So the fact that everything in existence has a cause, right, is caused by something, means that everything in existence must be able to be conceived through something else, i.e., its cause. Right? In order to understand anything, you need to understand its cause, and therefore everything can be conceived and must be conceived through something else. So, if every individual thing can be conceived and should be conceived through its cause, then none of the individual things will count as substance, right? Because they will all be able to be conceived through something else. So this definition of substance, that it must be conceived only through itself, means that none of the individual things in our experience can count as substances. The problem of the number of substances, whether there is one substance or more than one substance, also has to do with causation because uh, the question Spinoza asks is, where would more than one substance come from? Would one substance cause another substance? Uh, the answer is no. One substance can't be the cause of another substance because, uh, right, that would mean that a substance depends on something else. Um, its cause, right? One substance would be caused by another. The second substance would depend on the first substance and be conceived through the first substance, and therefore wouldn't count as a substance. So, in order for there to be more than one substance, they would each have to be self caused. Uh, now, what I think is interesting uh, is that Spinoza doesn't say that this is impossible, that it's impossible for there to be two self-caused substances. But in our experience of being, there is nothing to indicate more than one substance because everything can be related back to uh, its cause. Everything can be conceived through something else. Everything must be conceived through the totality. And as we'll see, it is that totality that is the substance. Substance for Spinoza is the totality of being. Uh, Now, it's therefore possible, right? We can imagine that there would be another substance, but it would not be a substance that we would have any contact with, or that we could conceive of, we could know or even think anything about, except that perhaps it exists. That's not Spinoza. I'm just pointing out something I think is interesting. Right? That Spinoza does not rule this out. So, existence is substance. Right? Substance is existence. Proposition 7, existence belongs to the nature of substance. Proposition 8, every substance is necessarily infinite. Now, substance is infinite. It involves existence, right? Existence belongs to substance. Uh, and we conclude the first chunk with proposition 11. God, or substance consisting of infinite attributes, each of which expresses eternal and infinite essence, necessarily exists. So, okay, let's try and just pull all this together a little bit. Substance is that which exists in itself and can be conceived through itself without relying on anything else. There is no individual body or entity that matches this definition of substance. Therefore, all of the individual bodies that we encounter do not count as substance. Substance, because it cannot be caused. If it were caused, then it would be conceived through something else. And because it also, as we'll see, can't deteriorate or die. Because in order for it to die or deteriorate, it would have to be acted upon by something else which would break it down, and therefore would be conceived through that thing that's acting upon it. substance must be infinite, right? There is no thing that will bring it into existence other than itself. More on that in a moment. And there's nothing that could take it out of existence, that could act on it so as to end it. So without beginning and without end, it must be infinite. Substance is God, right? And God has infinite attributes. Now, this God, right, this substance, is self-caused. And bears no relation to anything else. So I'm trying to um, recap this in a way that prepares us for the next section. Uh, yeah. Um, Substance is that Cartesian idea of being, right? Being is the totality of all true things. And all truths are eternal. All truths ultimately are derived from God. Right? Uh, as the perfect being that is the cause of all perfect truths, all existence, all being uh, is caused by and must be conceived through God. So, this idea of that God is the totality of being, that all of being constitutes one substance, which is God, uh, is a continuation of that idea of Descartes, that God is nature and nature is the totality of uh, scientifically observable facts. Uh, Being is truth, and truth is the effect of God. The only thing that really is this world of truth. Uh, I don't know. I think maybe this is kind of an obvious point on the surface, right? But it's um, it's become kind of a trope, right? Uh, the unity of being. All things are one. But what do we mean by that? Right? What does it mean to say all things are one? Um, so let's get into the second part here. God, or substance consisting of infinite attributes, each of which expresses eternal and infinite essence, necessarily exists. Okay, so God necessarily exists. Now, this is simply a more elaborate uh, proof of God in the same model as Descartes. Uh, let's look at the third proof here in proposition 11, because I think that this is one of the more straightforward proofs. Uh, he writes, to be able to not exist is weakness. On the other hand, to be able to exist is power, as is self-evident. All right, so that is the key insight, I think, that existence is power. Uh, he goes on. So if what now necessarily exists is nothing but finite entities, then finite entities are more potent than an absolute infinite entity, which is absurd. This is to say, we acknowledge that there is existence. I exist. And existence is power. I know that I am a finite power. And so the source of power in general can't be me, myself. The fact that I exist and therefore am a power means that there must be some ultimate source of power itself. And that source of power itself must be, right, an absolutely and infinitely powerful being. Uh, right? So if what now necessarily exists is nothing but finite entities, then finite entities are more potent than an absolutely infinite entity. If it's possible for finite power to exist, if it's possible for power to exist as finitude, then it must necessarily be true that infinite power exists. I mean, um, if we can conceive of a thing of infinite power, and we can, because we can conceive of a thing of finite power. And in order to understand finite power, we have to understand that power could conceivably extend beyond the limits of that finite power, beyond the limits of any finite power. Uh, Therefore, to conceive of finite power is to be able to conceive of infinite power. And if we can conceive of an infinitely powerful thing, then it's absurd to posit that that thing does not exist, because power is existence. Uh, I think the idea, obviously, is just that being is power. And whatever is by virtue of power, and is power itself. So that the fact that we can imagine infinite being, and we would posit the existence of infinite being, means that that being must exist. Okay, so let's change gears here a little bit. I think I did a better job explaining this in class, so my apologies. Uh, Beginning with proposition 13, the primary um, point of the next section is individuation. Individuation and change. If uh, being is united, if there is only one substance, if everything that exists is part of the same being, then how do we account for individuation? How do we account for the fact that there are individual bodies, right? That there is separation, difference, um, and more importantly, how do we account for change? How is change possible if there's only one substance? This is the key problem. If there's only one substance, then how does that substance change? Right? We would think change comes about by something acting on a thing, right? Something else changes something. Something is changed by virtue of something changing it. So if there's only one substance, there's nothing to act on that substance. There's nothing to change that substance. So what accounts for what appear to be changes within that unified substance? Uh, Normally, we'd say change in the world is caused by bodies acting upon each other. But if two bodies in existence ultimately can be reduced to the same substance, then what's happening when we think we see one body acting on another, one pool ball hitting another? Uh, Now, Spinoza is going to, continuing with this idea that substance is singular, he's going to make the argument that substance cannot be divided. Uh, Proposition 12. No attribute of substance can be truly conceived from which it would follow that substance can be divided. Proposition 13. Absolutely infinite substance is indivisible. Now, why can't substance be divided? We could imagine that substance, even if it is unified, could have parts. It could be broken up into parts. But the problem with this is in thinking about the nature of those parts. So the proof of proposition 12, the substance cannot be divided. He writes, the parts into which substance thus conceived would be divided will either retain the nature of substance or they will not. In the first case, each part will have to be infinite and self-caused and consist of a different attribute. And so several substances could be formed from one substance, which is absurd. Right? We've already seen that substance can't be the cause of another substance. Right? But this question of if you divide substance into parts, will each part have the same nature as the original substance? If they have the same nature, then they will each have to be self-caused and infinite. Now, To say that a part of substance could be self-caused is problematic because uh, to be self-caused means to generate yourself entirely through yourself. But if you generate yourself as a part of something else, then you aren't generating yourself as yourself. You're generating yourself through something else. A part of substance will necessarily be conceived through that original substance. And so can't be its own substance or have the same nature as substance. Uh, so that will be impossible. If a part of substance were self-caused, then it wouldn't be part of substance. The parts would have nothing in common with the whole, and the whole could exist and be conceived without its parts, the absurdity of which none can doubt. Right? In other words, if substance were to have a part, if there were to be a part of substance, that part, if it retains the nature of substance, would be completely unrelated to that original substance which it's supposed to be a part. Absurd. He goes on. In the latter case, where the parts will not retain the nature of substance, and then when the whole substance would have been divided into equal parts, it would lose the nature of substance and would cease to be. Okay, so if the parts of substance do not retain the nature of substance, if the parts of substance are not infinite and self-caused, then substance is made up of parts that don't share its essence. And in substance, there would be parts that are not self-caused, not eternal. Right? The eternal, the self-caused, don't admit of that. So, right, if the parts of substance have the same nature as substance, then the parts will be separate substances and not parts of a substance. If the parts of substance do not retain the same nature as substance, then they won't be parts. They won't be parts of substance because they won't share the nature of substance. So substance cannot be broken down into parts. Absolutely infinite substance is indivisible. Proposition 14, there can be or be conceived no other substance but God. God is this substance. And then again, which we sort of discussed, right? Proposition 15, whatever is in God, and nothing can be or be conceived without God. Okay, so whatever is in God, and nothing can be conceived or be without God. This is the point that I've been trying to make explicit about the connection to Descartes' concept of being here. That everything in being is truth, and all truth must be conceived through God. Therefore, all being is part of God and depends on God. Being is truth, truth is God. And so this proof, right, um, that everything is God, that God is all things, uh, is part of Spinoza's um, challenge to sort of theological conception of God. Right? He writes in the Scholium, some imagine God in the likeness of man, consisting of mind and body and subject to passions, but it is clear from what has already been proved how far they stray from the true knowledge of God. These I dismiss, for all who have given any consideration to the divine nature deny that God is corporeal. Uh, okay, so uh, they find convincing proof of this in the fact that by body we understand some quantity having length, breadth, and depth bounded by a definite shape, and nothing more absurd than this can be attributed to God, of being absolutely infinite. Um, okay, so the important idea here is that the challenge to theology um, is not that God is not made in man's image. Right? He says, anyone who's thought about this knows that that can't be the case. Obviously, God is not, an embodied being, a limited, finite body. God, um, you know, uh, doesn't have shape or form. Um, Descartes' idea here is that man resembles God or is made in God's image through the will. We resemble God in our infinite capacity to will. But Spinoza is going to challenge this also, this Cartesian idea. What's at stake here is something broader. The idea that because God cannot be like man in the sense of having a finite body, that God must not be corporeal at all, must have no physical existence. God cannot be corporeal. Now, this is the important point here. Um, Being is separated into, in traditional philosophy, right? In all philosophy, there's a distinction between appearances, physicality, and ideas and the intellect. Right? Um, what is this divide? What is this distinction? Moreover, the physical realm, the material realm, is in a state of constant change. It is constantly coming into being and going out of being. And therefore, right, uh, it's assumed that God cannot have a physical nature because the idea that God would come into or go out of existence or would change uh, doesn't make logical sense. God, as an all powerful, omniscient, and perfect, and infinite and eternal being, can't come into existence or go out of existence or change. Any change would mean a decrease in God's perfection. Any coming into being would mean that God has to be caused by something. And for God to be caused by something, God would have to be less powerful than something. There would have to be something more powerful than God. Uh, so God can't have a physical being. And therefore, physical being cannot be eternal and infinite. Uh, Corporeal being cannot be part of God in the sense that while God may be the cause of it, it can't be part of the essence of God. The essence of God lies in ideas, in the intellect, in the divine rationality which provides the laws according to which the physical world moves. Spinoza wants to challenge this idea and say, no, God is corporeal, God is physical, and it is possible to conceive of infinite, eternal physicality, a material world that is infinite and uh, and eternal, that is God. Right. So, what is the problem here? That um, it would seem this means that God changes, that God does come into and go out of existence, uh, and that God is not unified but divided into many different entities, as as the physical world is. Um, so this is, I think, an interesting point, and let's look at this a little more closely. The Scholium for proposition 15: whatever is in God, and nothing can be or be conceived without God. Uh, However, for a fuller explanation, I will refute my opponent's arguments, which all come down to this. Firstly, they think that corporeal substance, insofar as it is substance, is made up of parts, and so they deny that it can be infinite, and consequently, that it can pertain to God. This they illustrate with many examples, of which I will take one or two. They say that if corporeal substance is infinite, suppose it to be divided into two parts. Each of these parts will be either finite or infinite. If the former, then the infinite is made up of two finite parts, which is absurd. Uh, right? If your if corporeal substance, if physicality is infinite, um, then we have the problem that physical existence is divisible, right? Uh, and so, because corporeal existence is divisible, we imagine that infinite corporeality, infinite physicality, could be divided into parts, two finite parts, right? That because physicality is divided into finite parts, what infinite materiality would mean uh, is that infinity is made up of finite parts. I think that the idea can be put more simply by saying, what would it mean to divide infinity? What's half of infinity? It's an absurd question. Right? And so, uh, because physicality can be divided, uh, it seems to imply that physicality can't be infinite. Right? It's absurd to think about half of infinity. Similarly, if we say that there is infinite physicality, then we'll have to suppose many kinds of infinity or many infinities. For example, uh, the example he gives in this Scholium to proposition 15. If we draw a geometrical shape, we have point A here and a line AB that extends in a diagonal going up. We have a second line, line AC, that extends from point A going away. Right? So the two lines of a triangle extending infinitely. The infinite motion, the infinite movement of lines AB and AC going this way, right, as they extend away from point A, would be one infinity. They would move infinitely. But there would be a second kind of infinity, which would be the line BC, right, connecting point B, that is extending infinitely away from A, and point C, which is extending infinitely away from A. So you'd have an infinity moving this way, and then a second infinity moving this way between points B and C. I think it's simpler in the first example. Again, if an infinite length is measured in feet, it will have to consist of an infinite number of feet. And if it is measured in inches, it will consist of an infinite number of inches. So one infinite number will be 12 times greater than another infinite number. That we can imagine infinite feet, and we can imagine infinite inches. And those will not be identical, right? Infinite feet would be 12 times bigger than infinite inches, right? This is absurd. And so the argument is that therefore physicality can't be infinite. Right? Physicality must be finite, and therefore physicality can't be part of God. And Spinoza is going to say the mistake here is to understand physicality as measurable, infinite quantity as the proper way of understanding infinite physicality. That physicality, materiality, is distinct from quantity. Right? This is a really interesting and important point. So he writes, careful reflection will show that all those alleged absurdities from which they seek, these people he's trying to refute, from which they seek to prove that extended substance is finite, do not at all follow from the supposition that quantity is infinite, but that infinite quantity is measurable and is made up of finite parts. Therefore, from the resultant absurdities, no other conclusion can be reached but that infinite quantity is not measurable and cannot be made up of finite parts. So, what he's getting at is that essentially materiality is immeasurable as an idea, right? That, yeah, finite physical beings can be measured. They have a certain length and breadth, right? They have a certain quantity. But that if we extend materiality out and think of materiality in its essence, not as restrained within a finite body, then materiality becomes immeasurable. And two things to sort of say here. The first, this idea of multiple infinities is actually the foundation for a 20th century branch of mathematics called set theory, um, which was pioneered by George Cantor. Um, and this idea of multiple infinities thus becomes part of uh, the mathematical understanding of materiality in the 20th century. So this is absolutely correct. I mean, it's not an absurdity to say that there are multiple infinities within mathematics. But I think the larger point is that, set theory aside, uh, materiality, the bounds of the material world, are immeasurable. And whether we understand that at a micro or macro scale, it holds true. Right? We know that um, um, the further into an object you look, right? Once you get down to its atomic structure, once you get past the atoms and the electrons and protons and neutrinos, and quarks, right? You hit a point where you reach particles that literally cannot be measured, right? At least not measured by the human mind or human technology or any technology that we found. That particles don't have a clear and distinct measurement, but are indeterminate, are immeasurable. They become probabilities. Right? At the particle level, matter is probabilistic, not certain, and so that probability we could understand as immeasurability, as infinitude. So the infinitude of matter, and the same is true at the macro scale, right? So we're able to measure time and space back to the Big Bang, and we're able to, based on calculations about entropy and rate of deterioration of matter, we can make a guess about the potential lifespan of the universe. But again, right, this doesn't solve the philosophical problem of what happens to all that energy, all that matter, right? What's the cause of the Big Bang? What happens after the end of the universe? So even the sort of guesstimate that we can give to the duration of the universe is going to be, it appears as a measurement, but that's not going to satisfy Spinoza. All right. So what does it mean that matter physicality is infinite? It means that there is no separation between beings. That nature is continuous. I was having this conversation with my cousin, who's a biologist and a researcher at Harvard, and we were talking about philosophy of science in some sense, and he doesn't know anything about philosophy, and so I was surprised when he sort of very matter of factly came out and said, yeah, nature is continuous, and by that he meant there is no absolute individuation within nature. Nature is one. The distinction between bodies is a kind of arbitrary distinction. It's not an absolute distinction, right? Materiality, as we think of it in terms of matter, in terms of atoms and chemical compounds, and the like, right, is continuous. Um, when I die, right, my body turns into a different kind of matter. Uh, the matter of my body is not, privately owned by me. It's not that when I die, when my soul is extinguished, or my mind stops working, that that matter is removed from the universe. My physicality is not mine. My physicality belongs to the physical world. And when I die, that physical part of myself will be, right, transformed into a different kind of matter. This is the problem of the wax all over again, right? Descartes' wax. Materiality uh, is continuous, and the hard wax and the liquid wax um, are the same body, uh, right? Water, um, when it evaporates, doesn't lose any matter. Matter never leaves, right? So this is, I forget which law of thermodynamics, right? But nature never creates nor loses any energy. Is that correct? That's above my pay grade, the thermodynamics. But right, general rule of thumb, um, there's a cycle of energy, and energy is expended by being released and is then captured in another form. So, in terms of transformations and changes, uh, what this means is at the level of substance, there is there are no two bodies. There is just materiality that takes on different forms. Uh, right? So remember saying substance is one, and the attributes of substance express the essence of substance. What Spinoza is going to say is that this materiality expresses one essence, water, and that water is an attribute of substance. It expresses an essence. When that water evaporates, the same material, the same substance, takes on a new form, is transferred to a new attribute, a gas. But at the level of substance, at the level of materiality, there is no change. The change only occurs at the level of the attribute, of the essence that is expressed. Uh, right? So the unity of materiality, that's the idea. Now, um, I think that's enough about individuation. For now, right? I mean, because this problem of individuation um, is major. Let's look at Proposition 17 to think about another problem in this idea that substance is one, that being is entirely unified. There's no more than one substance, and substance is indivisible. And we said the first problem with this is that um, there are individuated bodies. How do we explain individuated bodies if substance is indivisible? Right? The way that we're going to explain individuated bodies is going to be at the level of attribute. We'll talk about that in the next class. Um, for now, let's move on to the second problem of indivisible substance, which is the problem of change. How is it possible for there to be change uh, if there's only one being? What Spinoza is going to say ultimately is there is no change. Change is an illusion. Not only is there no change, but there is no freedom. So, Proposition 17, God acts solely from the laws of his own nature, constrained by none. We touched on this a little bit. That God does not choose. So, let's read this. Proposition 17. God acts solely from the laws of his own nature, constrained by none. In the proof, we have just shown that an infinity of things follow absolutely solely from the necessity of divine nature. Right? That's a reference to uh, Proposition 16. From the necessity of the divine nature, there must follow infinite things in infinite ways. What is infinity, if not infinite things in infinite ways? And so, God, as infinite, is an infinite number of things in an infinite number of ways, importantly. So, there are an infinite number of things, and we've proved that nothing can be conceived without God, but that everything is in God. Therefore, there can be nothing external to God by which he can be determined or constrained to act. Thus, God acts solely from the laws of his own nature and is constrained by none. So this is what I was trying to explain in class. Right? That in order for God to be free to choose, for God to have choice, there would have to be something outside of God for him to choose between. There is only one choice for God, and that is God. He can choose nothing but his own essence. God acts solely from the laws of his own nature. He chooses his own nature. There is nothing else to choose. So in this Scholium, he writes, others take the view that God is a free cause because, so they think, he can bring it about that those things which we have said follow from his nature, that is, which are within his power, should not come about, that is, they should not be produced by him. Right? That God is capable of things that he refrains from doing. But this is as much as to say that God can bring it about that it should not follow from the nature of a triangle that its three angles are equal to two right angles, or that from a given cause the effect should not follow, which is absurd. And why would there be anything in God's essence as a perfect being that he would not choose? Like, there can be nothing that would not be worthy of choosing. Right? So we think God, could have made a worse world, or a better world, or a different world. No, right? This world is God. There is nothing beyond it, and the idea that it could be any different is either to wish that God would be less powerful or less perfect, um, or simply to misunderstand the nature of it. So the fact that God acts according to his own nature, and that everything that exists by virtue of God's essence, God's being, means that everything that exists must necessarily exist. Right? Everything that exists equally follows from God's nature. And therefore, there is no chance, there is no accident, there is no uh, free will. Because in order for there to be any of those things, there would have to be some area of being over which God does not have power. And that, according to Spinoza, is absurd, right? Because it's incompatible with the idea of an all-powerful being. So everything that happens as a result of God's essence. And because everything that is in God by necessity, as a necessary part of his being, everything that happens is necessary. There can be no human freedom for the same reason there can be no divine freedom, no freedom for God. We are God. We, as parts of God, act only according to the laws of God's essence and our essence, which is itself an effect of God's essence. Now, this is a strange idea of freedom, right? That God is free, but not free to choose, right? That freedom means nothing more than being. So freedom or free will would not only make God choose something other than his own essence. Right? To assume that God has free will means that he could choose other than himself. But it also implies, Spinoza says, that he would be indifferent to the choice. Were God to be able to choose between two different options, if he had to deliberate between two options, that would be absurd. Right? Because deliberation means not knowing. God can't choose because the condition of choice is not knowing. Right? I mean, you think about a choice. There's two ways it might go. You're given door A, door B. Uh, you don't know what's behind the other door. And the decision is basically random, a function of your ignorance. But then let's say you're given the choice between um, eating, uh, drinking paint and drinking water. Right? Um, well, yeah, you have a choice. You could drink the paint, um, but it's not really a choice, right? Um, every time you're going to take the water because of your essence, because of your nature, because of what you are. So, although there's a choice, there also isn't a choice. Right? And that's closer to the way the choice is for God. Uh, what is determined by the will. The choice isn't a choice because it's already been made. Right? When you're given a choice and um, you know, really want badly already one of the options, it's no choice. And so God is that will and desire. Now, desire is probably the wrong word, but is that will, is that being that knows perfectly what it wants and has no obstacles stopping it from getting what it wants. So choice and options don't make any sense for God. Uh, God's freedom lies in being. It's not choice, but pure will. And pure will without obstacle or divergence uh, is at once absolute freedom and absolute necessity, right? Because nothing will determine it but itself. So this is a really crucial point that in God, freedom and necessity are one and the same. God is absolutely free to be exactly what he is. And because of that absolute freedom to be what he is, he will never be anything other than what he is. Uh, Now, right, therefore, everything he does will follow necessarily from his essence, from his being. And what follows from God is existence, is being, the world. Right? Therefore, everything in the world happens as a necessary effect of God's essence. Uh, and this leads to another interesting conversation. Well, in this same Sholium, right, which is about what this idea of will and intellect are in God. Now, God's essence sorry, um, God's essence is unique, and unique in part because it is not, it does not have will or intellect, right? Uh, will and intellect refer to choice, right? I need the intellect to choose. I need the will to choose. But God doesn't have to make choices, right? God simply exists. And whatever he is, is. Uh, so it doesn't make sense to Spinoza to say that God has intellect. And this is controversial, right? But this is not to say that God is not the cause of thinking or ideas or of human intellect. He absolutely is. But God doesn't have intellect in the sense that he doesn't have to deliberate. He never has to make a choice. He never has to think. Thinking is about trying to arrive at the truth, trying to know. But for an all-knowing being, a being who is eternally all-knowing, there would be no need for intellect, for thinking. Similarly, in a being that never has to make a choice, there would be no need for will, and for a being that never has to overcome an obstacle, there would be no need for will. So for Spinoza to say that God has, quote unquote, will and intellect is wrong. Instead, it's more that God is intellect, is will, so that when a being like us that has intellect and will uses intellect and will, they are acting right, in concert with the divine intellect and will. When I know the truth, I've attained oneness with God. And what that means is that I don't agree with God, but I've learned God. God doesn't have to learn anything. God is the truth that must be learned. And so in learning the truth, I bring myself into communion with God. But that's not to say that God agrees or has an idea. So he writes in the same Scholium to Proposition 17, God's intellect, will, and power are one and the same. Right? In God, the weaknesses that we associate with intellect and will are absent. And there is nothing but power. Power expressed through intellect means the existence of ideas, the existence of truths in the intellectual realm. The power of will means the actualization of action, which is the power imbued in worldly things. God's will is that physicality be. God's will is expressed through and as physicality. It is the power that lies in being, the power that is existence. And God's intellect is the power that is thinking and truth. So, the last thing I want to say is what this implies is there is no human freedom. There is no change, not real change. And there is no individuation or differentiation. All is one, and everything that exists necessarily. Our All right, so we'll pick this up again, and there's a lot more to discuss in this. So we'll talk about it again in class on Monday. All right. See you then.